Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, founder and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, the foundation that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. And this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host Richard Ebeling, who's a professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to be with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, of course, we were out of action last week primarily because of you. Would you like to explain to our viewers what caused you to be out of action last week?
Well, there was this hurricane called Hurricane Dorian, and it came up the east coast of the United States and was a Category 3. And so my wife and I had our lives a little disrupted, boarding up the house, batting down the hatches, and evacuating for a couple of days. Fortunately, the destruction was not in any way severe, but it's better to be safe than sorry. And as a consequence of that, it was just impossible to do it last week. So my apologies for those who are frustrated, disappointed, or depressed because they didn't have the two of us last week. But we are back.
Actually, we got flooded with some emails saying thank you so much for skipping a week.
You heard him say this, not me. Do you see what I have to put up with? And this is week after week.
All right, let's talk about a serious topic. Let's talk about Afghanistan, because that's back in the news. Of course, it's the longest running war in American history. You know, Richard, when I was a young person in college studying history, and I heard about something called the 30 Years' War, I thought, that's impossible. There's just no way that a war can go on 30 years. And now, with the war in Afghanistan, I can see how it happens. I mean, we're on 18 years now, and there's apparently no end in sight, so we could break the record. This could be the 32-year war. And
there was 100 years war.
100 years war. Okay, we could strive for that record too, and it's just so ironic because you've got people like George W. Bush gets us into this mess, and then you've got Barack Obama that just vows that, boy, I'm going to pull the troops out if you elect me. And 8 years later, he still has troops in Afghanistan. You've got Trump saying the same thing. I'm going to pull the troops out of these forever wars. I'm going to bring them home from Afghanistan. They're still there under his regime. And so it's back in the news because Trump had said that he had planned this top secret surprise meeting at Camp David with members of the Taliban and possibly even the Afghan regime, which they installed in the power, but they have not included in any of the peace negotiations, if you can believe that. But in any event, Trump got upset, as he tends to do, apparently because, or at least he says because the Taliban initiated an attack that killed one more American soldier, and Trump said this was just unfair, that this shouldn't be happening when we're negotiating, and so he called it all up. I have a hunch that there's more to it than that. But here's the amusing part of this, is that he's going to enter into this peace treaty, or intended to, in which the Taliban would agree in writing that it would not provide a safe haven for Al-Qaeda. And it's really kind of silly, because you're going to trust the people that have been killing American troops as they're trying to evict them from their country. There's going to be in writing, you promise not to do this. What's Trump going to do? Sue them for breach of contract if they provide Al-Qaeda with a safe haven? So, in any event, Trump is now stuck. He actually sent more troops to Afghanistan than were there when he first got started as president. So there's no indication that they're going to pull them all out, which is really the only solution to this thing. This war is lost. It was lost from the day it started. And as you'll recall, Richard, after the 9/11 attacks, you and I and FFF, other writers on FFF, we said the worst thing you can do in response to this terrorist attack is to invade Afghanistan. And we fiercely opposed that invasion. We also fiercely opposed the Iraq invasion. And of course, Iraq was even more clear because no Iraqi had ever attacked the United States, and yet here we initiate this huge war of aggression against the Iraqi people that killed tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. So they invade Afghanistan, and the popular conception is, oh, Al Qaeda was serving as a safe haven. Well, that's just an excuse that came after the fact. The truth is that the invasion of Afghanistan had nothing to do with that. They were never able to come up with any evidence, U.S. officials, of Afghan government Taliban complicity in the 9/11 attacks. So to hold a nation liable because somebody within that nation goes out and commits a criminal offense is ludicrous. And Bush understood that. The real reason he invaded had to do with extradition. He was demanding that the Taliban regime turn over bin Laden to the CIA. The Afghan regime had no extradition treaty with the United States, and this clearly was a criminal offense. That's why they're prosecuting people at Gitmo now, and why they've prosecuted terrorists in Washington and New York and elsewhere. It's a straight criminal offense under the U.S. Code. And the Afghans said, look, we don't have an extradition treaty with you, but here's what we'll do. If you will provide us some evidence of complicity here, like you would do in an extradition treaty, we would turn over bin Laden to an independent third party where he gets a fair trial instead of being tortured and executed by the CIA. And Bush said, absolutely not. You will do as we have ordered you to do. You will turn over bin Laden. And the Afghan regime said no. And that's when Bush said, well, then we're going to invade you. So it was more than just a police action. What you and I were saying was, look, set a bounty for bin Laden, send out people looking for him, wait him out like they did with the terrorist after the World Trade Center bombing in '93. But instead, Bush says, no, we're going to not only have the police action against bin Laden, we're going to invade the country in order to effect a regime change operation. Most of the people they've killed in this operation for 18 years had absolutely nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks. And the entire effort of the Taliban ever since has been to evict the U.S. from Afghanistan the same way the Afghans evicted the Soviets from Afghanistan. Well, it's just a matter of time. We all know that. This peace agreement was some sort of face-saving device to make it look like the U.S. was leaving on its own terms. But it's going to leave. It's either going to leave like it left Vietnam, with helicopters off the tops of the embassy buildings, with people fleeing and panic to get out of there before the Taliban takes over, or it's going to be with the U.S. just formally withdrawing, which is what they should do at this point. But one way or the other, this whole thing has been a disaster. What do you think?
Well, I can only just reiterate a number of your points. You mentioned when this whole tragic sequence of events began. Obviously, it was a shock and a terrible loss of life and hysteria with the destruction of the trade towers. I was recently talking to someone who actually was on one of the upper floors when this happened, and he fortunately got out with the people on his floor. I know people who used to work in what was then one of the headquarters for the Wall Street Journal at the lower levels, who were fortunate to get out. And, he was saying how when he finally got to the street, people were horrified to look up because they saw people so desperate with fire and destruction jumping to their deaths from the higher floors, then the building collapsing, and this huge plume of smoke that engulfs the lower part of Manhattan. This is a terrible thing. But as you're pointing out, this was a criminal act, no different than if someone robs a bank or targets someone or some group of people because of some personal grudge against them. It may have a particular motive, but it's just a private criminal act by a cadre of people. It was not initiated by a government per se. But then, rather than dealing with it in some way, as you suggested, the Bush administration decided to undertake this policy of massive invasion. Now, I should mention that not long after 9/11, but before our invasion of Afghanistan, I was asked to participate in a symposium on the online edition of the Christian Science Monitor newspaper. And I and a couple of other people were given a series of questions to answer about what we should do. And at that time, I said that Bush had given his address to the joint session of Congress. And I emphasized that. And at one point in his address, he said such things as the American people had to be patient. There was no way that justice could be assured swiftly. It may take time to track down those suspected of having organized this action, bin Laden and others. And he referred to the Old West in the wanted posters, wanted dead or alive, with bounties, as one of the means to try to bring the perpetrators or the suspected perpetrators to justice. And I said, that's what should be followed. Rather than an invasion involving tens of thousands of American military personnel, the scorching of the Afghan land by an American conflict with the Taliban, in the footsteps of the Afghanis suffering so much already with their episode of the attempted Soviet takeover, not that earlier. Then rather than risk American lives and proper wealth and the tragedy for the Afghan people, Bush should follow his own advice. Put a bounty on these people, $1 billion for bin Laden, $500 million for each of his suspected accomplices in the planning and organizing of this, and set free retired Green Berets, Special Forces, Navy SEALs, retired people from the French Foreign Legion, etc., and let them, in one way or another, get into Afghanistan, hunt these people down, and bring them out, preferably alive, to be put on trial, as you want in the normal and civilized way of bringing an accused person to justice. But if not, the old bounties used to say wanted dead or alive. That would cost far less in life and wealth than an invasion. Now, retrospectively, almost 20 years later, this has cost us far more than a few $1 billion. It's cost thousands of American lives. It has cost the lives and ruined the lives of, tens upon thousands of Afghanis. It has ripped the society apart for another almost 2 decades. And it took forever to track down bin Laden and in Pakistan. And I stand by the views that I held there. And then I was asked one other thing. Well, in one of the questions, Jacob, if I can just add this as well. Why did I think this attack occurred? And what did I think could be done to minimize a similar attack in the future? And in my replies, I said that there are people who are religious fanatics, and religious fanatics do many crazy things. But we could not discount and we could not ignore that a good part of their anger and resentment and desire for revenge against the United States was not per se because of, quote, who we are, unquote. They may dislike democracy and the American notion of personal liberty and secularism. But what really motivated these people was their anger and resentment over American intervention in the Middle East. And they're viewing that the Americans were sacrilegiously impacting the holy sites of Islam, were supporting corrupt regimes against Islamic teaching. And bin Laden many times said, and assuming, it's not just rhetoric, sometimes people mean what they say, his desire was for the United States to stop intervening and to leave the people in these countries to have their own, unfortunately, sectarian battles among themselves to manage their own societies. Every time the United States invades or intervenes in one way or another in a country, invariably the U.S. government, any government that does this, ends up picking sides. And the side that you have not picked to support invariably views you as its opponent now, and therefore is as much an enemy as the domestic faction or existing government that they're fighting against. As the old adage says, the friend of my enemy is my enemy. And by the United States following these policies for decades of choosing winners and attempting to overthrow losers, as they define them, and using diplomatic and economic and military forms of intervention to influence the play of the game. Oh my gosh, you mean the United States attempting to influence the politics and elections in other countries? I'm shocked. I'm shocked. We created the circumstance in which a number of these religious fanatics and others have decided to turn their wrath upon the United States. And then I answered what was basically the final question, as I recall. Well, what is to be done? It's basically to withdraw. Stop militarily intervening in these parts of the world. And once we do so, we will minimize, not prevent, but we will minimize the circumstances that create the animosity against America that sets such people loose. And that is the policy we should follow. If an American, as a private citizen, wants to go to another country and participate in whatever its affairs are, they're free to do so as a free human being, but they're on their own. But the United States government should not have done this, has brought tragedy both to America and to Afghanistan in doing so, and has brought a lot of lost freedoms here at home in the process.
Yeah, all the points you make are very, very good. Let me refortify them. The point you make about what we were recommending at that time is perfectly valid. But you'll recall that we got attacked just mercilessly. I mean, there were subscription cancellations coming in. What we were essentially saying after the 9/11 attacks is, this is a time for wisdom. This is a time for prudence. You know, think through what the response should be here instead of just this knee-jerk response. And boy, people were just, you know, you're weak, you love the terrorists, you hate America, because it was this knee-jerk support of George W. Bush's attitude of wanting to wreak vengeance. And even if the vengeance is being wreaked on people that had nothing to do with the attacks, like people in Iraq, most of the people in Afghanistan, it didn't matter. That we're just going to go out there with bombs and missiles and troops, and we're going to wreak just unbelievable retaliation to make sure nobody ever does this again. Well, if you look back at the '93 attack on the World Trade Center, they handled it, U.S. officials handled it exactly like you and I were saying should be handled after the 9/11 attacks. They found one of the perpetrators, a guy named Ramzi Youssef, hiding out in Pakistan. Well, they didn't invade Pakistan and kill a bunch of Pakistanis in order to capture this guy. They did some investigation. They realized that this is a criminal offense. That's what terrorism is. And they got into Afghanistan. They grabbed this guy. They brought him back to the United States. And at his hearing, it was very instructive, his sentencing hearing. Youssef was filled with rage, you could tell this. And he didn't talk about hatred for America's freedom and values and that kind of nonsense. He pointed directly. He even said to the federal judge, he said, you call me a terrorist, but it's you people who are the butchers, because look what you have done in the Middle East. And that was where it goes to motive. They were talking about the embargo, the sanctions against Iraq that had killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. You recall that a few years later, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Madeleine Albright, told 60 Minutes that the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children, while hard, were in fact worth it. And worth it, she meant regime change. Well, Americans may not have paid much attention to that statement, but I guarantee you people in the Middle East did. And by this time, U.S. troops were stationed near Mecca and Medina, which are the holiest lands in the Muslim religion. So here are these so-called infidels right near their holy lands. There was the unconditional military support to the Israeli government, regardless of its mistreatment of Palestinians. All of this was develop a cauldron of rage and anger. And we were saying this before 9/11. We were publishing articles saying, if you don't stop this interventionism, you're going to get a major attack on U.S. soil. Which it didn't take a rocket scientist to predict that, because you had the '93 attack on the World Trade Center, you had the attacks on the USS Cole, the attacks on the American embassies in East Africa. But, and we weren't the only ones. Chalmers Johnson, the famous analyst who had formerly worked for the CIA, he wrote a book called Blowback, where he said the exact same thing before 9/11. So when 9/11 hits, we said, look, let's talk about motive here. And I wrote an op-ed that's on our website about 3 weeks after 9/11 saying, is it too early to talk about foreign policy here? Well, immediately, you're justifying what the terrorists did, and cancel my support. And those were tough times for FFF. But what we were saying is that you have to study motive. Motive is not justification. A prosecutor in a criminal case talks to the jury about motive of the murderer. He's not justifying what the murderer did. Well, why is that important? Well, because if there had been no intervention, if there had been no sanctions on the Iraqi people killing those children, if there had not been these other interventions after the end of the Cold War, there never would have been a 9/11 attack. There wouldn't have been an invasion of Afghanistan or an invasion of Iraq. At least they wouldn't have had that excuse to do these invasions. And then even more important, by studying motive and analyzing it correctly, that would have meant no invasion of Afghanistan. It would have meant, well, maybe we need to stop intervening. Instead, they doubled down on their interventions. They invade Afghanistan, they invade Iraq, saying, oh no, the terrorist attacks have nothing to do with our interventions. They have everything to do with hatred for America's freedom and values. Well, now they generate even more anger and more rage, which is 18-year war in Afghanistan, this war in Iraq. And so you've got terrorism over here on American soil, the killer at Fort Hood, the would-be bomber in Detroit. So they generate their own demand for terrorism with their continued interventionism, which they then use as the excuse to take away our freedoms here at home. And that's how we get this formalized assassination program, where they have the authority to assassinate Americans without a trial, without due process, take Americans into custody, torture them, put them in the military dungeons, all without due process. I mean, this is an incredible thing. Secret surveillance. So in the process of doubling down on this interventionism, they've ended up destroying our freedom and our economic well-being too, with the out-of-control federal spending and debt. Yeah. All in all, it's just been a total disaster.
Yeah, I can sort of pick up on that, one of your last themes, and that is the effect of these two wars on American freedom at home. I remember a time when you could walk into an airport and go through virtually no security, accompany a relative or a friend to the gate to see them off, or to meet relatives and friends who were arriving, to go to the top of the terminal building and watch the planes land using telescopes to have a better view of them. That is a world that's gone. There was a world in which you didn't have to worry about surveillance cameras every which way, under the threat not just of crime in general, but there could be terrorist threats affecting cities and communities. There was a time that we did not have the Department of Homeland Security, which is concentrated in centralized surveillance and intrusive powers within the hands of the federal government, more than was already the case, that now we take for granted, that we basically have a national surveillancing and investigating police agency beyond the FBI that in fact has widely unrestricted powers. We take for granted that they can surveillance our computers, follow our keystrokes, read our email, with these kangaroo courts that they use for permissions to do these things. The everyday freedom that we have been seeing chipped away because of this war is immense. The problem is that there was this shock, and there was this attitude that something had to be done, This agency is first put together and then formalized as a presidential cabinet level institution. And then its bureaucracy grows, its budget grows, its authority is extended until finally we have this monster. I don't want to use the term secret police because that has connotations but it's basically our version of a national police agency, basically watching, surveilling, intruding, investigating, in principle, anything that any American does that they view as a threat to national security. Now, and if I can just make one other point, one of the most frustrating things about bureaucracy is that it is extremely difficult ever to shrink it or make it go away. Because once a bureaucracy is in place, you have real flesh and blood human beings who, for them, that agency and its activities are the source of their income, their status in society, their senses of importance and power, and they have several motives to keep justifying what they're doing, extend the powers that they have, and to get larger budgets. Those are the means by which promotions are made possible, salary increases can occur, and the authority of what you're allowed to do, your little bailiwick of the bureaucracy, is increased. So I'll make this prediction. I'm not a betting man, but I even bet $10. Okay, I'm going out on a limb now. I bet $10 that even if hypothetically there is a point in the future when it is felt that the threat of terrorism has been defeated, that for all intents and purposes, terrorism is no longer an issue or a problem for America as a whole or the everyday American going through their lives, the Department of Homeland Security will not go away. If there have been no terrorist attacks, what they will say, Jacob, is that, you see, this is why we're so important. You can't dismantle us. You can't reduce our budgets. See, we've kept us safe. If anything, the world changes and there's new technologies. We need more authority and more budgets to keep doing the good work. If there is, tragically and unfortunately, a serious terrorist attack, do you know what that same bureaucracy at the Department of Homeland Security will say? You see, you didn't make our budget big enough. We needed more authority. It's the failure to extend our power that has enabled this to happen. So no matter what happens, they're going to rationalize their rice bowl and their positions in the bureaucracy, never to be diminished or taken away. This is like an albatross that's going to be around the neck of the American people and growing in authority every time some little hiccup occurs of a threat or a fear for as long as the eye can see into the future of the United States. Unless there is a radical political and ideological change in the thinking and the vision of what a free America should be and what the government should and should not do, this is a burden for us in terms of financial cost of tax money and an intrusiveness into our lives that we're going to live through and our children and grandchildren will likely live through. Again, unless there's a radical political, philosophic, and ideological shift in the climate of American opinion.
I couldn't agree with you more. And you hear people saying, "Oh well, we're losing our freedom." That's ridiculous. I mean, that train arrived at the station a long time ago. I hold that our freedom has been destroyed because there is no way that you can genuinely say that people are free who live in a society that has a organization like Homeland Security in their midst, the TSA in their midst, an entity that has the power to assassinate them without due process, to torture them, indefinitely detain them. This cannot, in any reasonable sense, be called a free society. And there's the thing that every American needs to keep in mind is that there is a way to restore a free society, a normally functioning society, one that doesn't have all this secret surveillance and pat downs and fondling at airports and assassination schemes. And there's a way out of this morass. And that way is one, you pull all the troops home from everywhere, Korea, Latin America, Middle East, Afghanistan, Africa. You bring them all home and just discharge them. They're totally unnecessary. They're worse than unnecessary. They're actually causing the conditions for a continuous stream of anti-American terrorism. You bring them home, the demand for terrorism dissipates. So you don't even have the safe haven argument anymore, which was always ridiculous, because terrorists can get together in a hotel room in Hamburg, Germany, like they did before the 9/11 attacks. You don't need a place like a whole country like Afghanistan. But the point is that once you get rid of the interventionism, the anti-American terrorism disintegrates. So what do you need Homeland Security for? What do you need the TSA? All of a sudden you're talking about a movement toward a free society. But you got to do more than that. In addition to restoring a non-interventionist foreign policy, which was the founding foreign policy of this nation, you've got to restore a limited government republic, which means you got to get rid of the Pentagon, the military-industrial complex, the CIA, and the NSA. This is a totalitarian form of government structure. It was brought into existence to fight the Soviet Union in a Cold War, which itself was a national security state. China is a national security state. Pakistan, Egypt, North Korea, Cuba, they're all national security states, and so is post-World War II U.S. We need to restore a limited government republic, which was our founding governmental system. Now we're talking about restoring a genuinely, normally functioning functional society, a free society, a prosperous society, rather than one in which there's this intrusive surveillance, assassination, torture, detention system that really the military is in charge of, and the CIA and the NSA. Along with, of course, the domestic side, the legalized drugs, get rid of the drug war, which of course has eviscerated freedom in America, get rid of all the mandatory charity programs, beginning with the crown jewel, the Social Security and Medicare. Then we're starting to talk about a genuinely free society. What Americans need to realize is there is this way out. It's through libertarianism. But as long as people continue to maintain that, we've got to keep this apparatus in place to keep us safe, they have to keep killing people overseas in these forever wars, we're going to continue living this life of an unfree society.
I agree. But we have to accept the fact that this change will not occur unless those admittedly minority voices in American society today who still have an appreciation and an understanding and a desire for the type of freedom that was the inspiration and the goal of the founding fathers when this country was established. Unless there are enough of us who are willing to understand the principles, articulate the principles, speak out for the principles, defend the principles, and slowly but surely influence our fellow Americans to see that freedom has been lost, which many do not see, and that freedom can and should be restored, and what a free society could be in terms of liberty and prosperity and opportunity and peace. Unless enough of our fellow Americans are willing to do that, we will continue in this path. It is not inevitable. Nothing is written in the sky. Trends do change, they have changed, and they will change again. But it requires the integrity and the actions of real human beings who care about the ideals of liberty.
Yeah, well, it's a good point you make, and the positive sign of this, a couple of years ago there was a woman professor from Texas A&M called Elizabeth Cobbs, who later took a sojourn at the Hoover Institution. She wrote a fantastic op-ed in the LA Times that I would recommend everybody to go read. It's called The Founders' Foreign Policy, where she talked about the founding foreign policy of America. But in that op-ed, she cited a Pew Foundation poll that indicated a large number of people, I forget the exact percentage, but like 65 to 70% of Americans now believe that it's time for the U.S. to mind its own business and let the world manage its own affairs. And then I read recently that most Americans now want the U.S. government to end these forever wars. Well, that's progress, Richard, that we've made, and somehow or another, I think we're headed toward a collision point where most Americans are saying enough's enough with foreign interventionism. It hasn't worked. It's destroyed our country. It's destroyed our economic well-being. Time to bring the troops home and have the U.S. government mind its own business. And then let the American private sector. People say, oh, that's isolationism. That's ridiculous. You liberate the private sector to interact with the people of the world. That's where unilateral free trade comes in. We're ending these trade wars and sanctions and embargoes. So while statists today want to keep the government unrestrained to stomp on people around the world and are building walls to isolate the private sector, we want to do the exact opposite. We want to bring the government in, when we'll rein it in, but liberate the private sector to travel and trade and interact with the people of the world.
Yes.
So on that note, we're out of time. We'll wrap it up. Greatly enjoyed the conversation as always, Richard, and look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time, and as I always like to remember to do, thank you all of those who have viewed us and listened to us today for sharing a little bit of your time with us, and we hope you'll tune in next time.
Yeah, I'll echo that. And if you're brand new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, you're watching this for the first time, come and visit us at fff.org. I write a daily article, blog post. Richard writes for us in our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. We also publish an article weekly by him. And we've got the Libertarian angle. So thank you for your interest in FFF. Thank you for support of our foundation. We certainly can't do it without those of you that financially support us. And we look forward to talking to you all next week.